Understand the events that influenced the writing of Islamic history, we need to recognize several things. First, it is my belief there was a literary vacuum in the early Islamic empire, created by zealous Muslims who destroyed books and manuscripts, erased inscriptions, burned libraries, and destroyed all literature except the Quran, which was mostly bits and pieces of what people remembered of the revelations that Muhammad gave. This destruction of written material by the Islamic forces has been well documented. One piece of evidence is a letter from 640 AD from the Caliph to General Amru, the leader of the Muslim armies in Egypt, who asked the Caliph what should he do with the thousands of manuscripts he found in warehouses in Alexandria. The Caliph's answer has been recorded and known for centuries.
As for the books you mention, here is my reply. If their content is in accordance with the revelations of Allah, we may do without them, for in that case the revelations of Allah more than suffice. If on the other hand, they contain matter not in accordance with the revelations of Allah, there can be no need to preserve them. Proceed then and destroy them.
The Muslim writer Ibn al-Kifti tells us that the books were distributed to the public baths of Alexandria, where they were used to feed the stoves, which kept the baths comfortably warm.
They say it took 6 months to burn all that mass of material.
Eutychius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, recorded that there were 4,000 baths that received books from the Alexandrian library.
This burning of books, however, did not start in Egypt, but 4 years earlier in Persia. Caliph Umar's army met with the Persian armies in the Battle of Qadisiyah in the year 636 AD. In early January 637, the Muslim advance guard reached the outskirts of Ctesiphon and laid siege to the city for 2 months. Eventually the city fell and the Muslims occupied it. During the fighting, the palaces and the library at Ctesiphon were deliberately burned. In the end, the only book that managed to survive in Arabia was the glorious Quran.
When it comes to the history of the Quran, historians have struggled. It seems that most of the Quran was retained in an oral fashion rather than written form. While the Arabs were great memorizers and had the ability to retain the entirety of the Quran, the retention of materials in an oral tradition suffers from several difficulties. First, the accuracy of the memories of the individuals involved must be perfect. In the case of the Quran, arguments arose over the various verses, how they should be rendered, and if they should or should not be included in the whole. Second, the problem of transferring knowledge from the learned to the novice is often a difficult step. In the case of the Quran, most of the men who memorized the sayings of Muhammad were also warriors. As is often the case, warriors die in battle, and their knowledge of the Quran perished with them. This is amply illustrated in the Battle of Yamama, when an estimated 450 men who had memorized the Quran were killed.
Hudayfa bin al-Yaman came to Uthman at the time when the people of Damascus and the people of Iraq were waging war to conquer Armenia and Azerbaijan. Hudayfa was afraid because the people of Damascus and Iraq had differences in the recitation of the Quran. So he said to Uthman, "O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the revelations." So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa saying, "Send us your manuscript of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials into perfect copies and return the manuscript to you." Hafsa sent it. Then a group of men sat down to create a new copy of the Quran. Uthman said to the 3 Quraysh men, "In case you disagree, write it in the dialect of Quraysh, for the Quran was revealed in their tongue."
When several copies were written, Uthman returned the original manuscript to Hafsa. Uthman then sends every Muslim province 1 copy of what's been written, and he orders that all other Quranic material, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or even in whole copies, that they all be burned.
and so the burning continued. This time, even Quranic materials were burnt. But it did not stop the arguing about what should or should not be included in the Quran. When the new Qurans arrived in various provinces, people argued against them.
Sa'id bin Thabit said, a verse from Surah Al-Ahzab was missed when we copied the Quran, and I used to hear Allah's apostle reciting it. So we searched for it and found it with Huzaymah bin Thabit al-Ansari.
These 5 or 6 copies were now the only Qurans in the entire Muslim empire. Uthman's order to burn all other Quranic material tried to wipe out all Qurans everywhere, except the few that were held by the provincial governors.
In effect, all non-Muslim books were destroyed, and then the Muslims destroyed all of their own books and writings, except for 5 or 6 copies. Remember, the Islamic Empire at this time stretched from the Atlantic Ocean through the Middle East all the way to Afghanistan, and only 5 or 6 copies of the Quran existed in all those millions of square kilometers. This is what I refer to when I speak of a literary vacuum. Much later, once the Abbasids took control of the Islamic Empire, they recognized this literary vacuum and they set out to correct it. The problem was, they were interested in producing an Abbasid version of Islamic history. So all of the materials produced under the Abbasid control reflected the politically correct version of Abbasid history. These histories and hadiths about the previous 250 or more years were collected, copied, and distributed. Those books that were written earlier were either destroyed or edited by later writers who thought they found errors in them.